All right, good afternoon everyone. My name is Michael, and today I'm excited to talk to you about a group of animals I am very passionate about, the pterosaurs. But I'll try to keep it as layperson accessible as I can, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterward as well. So a little about me. You're seeing me like twice the size. So I studied paleontology, specifically pterosaurs. That's actually what the focus of my PhD research at Loma Linda University. I've been interested in paleontology literally as far back as I can remember. When I was 3 years old, I decided I wanted to be a vertebrate paleontologist, and you can ask any family member and they'll back that up. So I grew up in Western Illinois on a farm, so I had a lot of opportunity to run around in the woods and in the creek, and that's where I started collecting all these like tiny little fossils of crinoids and brachiopods and other fossils that were once the bottom of a shallow sea. And if you know anything about Illinois, you might know that it is not at the bottom of a shallow sea right now. So from the very beginning, I was learning about how the Earth changes over time. So then, fast forward 20 years, I moved out to California for my PhD. I got married. My wife Melissa is in the back, and she is my PowerPoint coordinator. And another little tidbit before we start, a relevant tidbit, is my favorite pterosaurs are one called Jungivorous, which I like it just because I think it looks cool, and a Nerdnothus, which is just a cute little mutt-like creature. This would be one of the little bitty pterosaurs, like we're talking, 9-inch, 1 foot wingspan. So first of all, what is a pterosaur? The most important single piece of information you can walk away with today is that pterosaurs are not actually dinosaurs. In fact, there's not a single dinosaur on this entire slide. Now, these are often confused as dinosaurs in popular culture and popular media. But dinosaur is not a catch-all term for anything like reptilian and prehistoric. Their reptiles and life in general is incredibly diverse, and so not everything big and dead is a dinosaur. Dinosaur is a label for a specific group of animals with a specific suite of characteristics. However, dinosaurs and pterosaurs do share a common ancestor. So while they're not one and the same, they are cousins, and dinosaurs are the next closest relative to pterosaurs. But we know what pterosaurs are not. So what are pterosaurs? What are some of the things that describe the group? So they're an extinct, unfortunately, group of warm-blooded flying reptiles. The name pterosaur means winged reptile, which you can probably piece together why. They lived during the Triassic period, so the Cretaceous period. So they appear around 228 million years ago and go extinct 66 million years ago. And that happens to be just overlapped really nicely with when dinosaurs appeared and went extinct, which kind of leads further to the confusion that, there's a misconception that pterosaurs are dinosaurs because they lived during almost the exact same time. And the sizes of pterosaurs could range from very, very small, like sitting in the palm of your hand, so bat size, to terrifyingly large, as we'll see in a minute. So the wing of pterosaurs was supported by a single hyper-elongated finger. Pterosaurs were covered in kind of a fuzzy hair-like integument called pycnofibers. And they were a very diverse group. It's not like, you've seen one pterosaur, you've seen them all. They have the same basic body layout, but after that, the diversity kind of explodes. So they all had all kinds of different beak shapes and diets, tooth forms, some are toothless, tail length. They lived in different habitats and were doing different things, and different ways of flying. And again, just want to note this, that they were not dinosaurs. So the first pterosaur fossil that was ever actually formally described was done so in 1784 by a Swiss paleontologist or scientist named Cosimo Collini. This is the actual specimen, by the way, that he looked at. And it was actually donated to his curiosity cabinet, which is a precursor to today's natural history museums. But Again, so in 1784, remember, this is when paleontology was in its infancy. Like, it was very, very new as a scientist. We were just beginning to, or Western scientists were just beginning to like find these like dinosaurs and other weird animals of the past. And so when this thing was presented to him, Pliny had no idea what kind of animal it was. He speculated that it was from the deep ocean, not because of any like part of its anatomy, but just because like he said, hey, this is weird, the ocean's a big place, so it probably comes from there, right? So in 1800, a scientist by the name of Herman made this illustration, and he had not even actually seen the specimen in person, but there's some issues like where he was worried that like, you know, it was gonna get lost in the French Revolution or something. And so he, based on a description and illustrations of this fossil, he made this drawing. And so this is the very first life reconstruction of a pterosaur that anyone ever done in 1800. And it's really interesting because he reconstructed it as a mammal. So we have, you can't really see it on the screen, but it has little ears here. It was covered in like a fur. But despite that, like all things considered, it was pretty spot on because he reconstructed it as a flying animal. Didn't catch on immediately because even into the mid-1800s, there are some people who were thinking that this specimen, Pterodactylus, was an aquatic animal, this time using actual anatomy to back it up, so they interpreted this wing as a paddle. And, you know, considering where paleontology was at the time, like this isn't a bad guess. I mean, it kind of reminds me of a penguin. Like this is pretty plausible if you know nothing else about this group of animals. There were also, in the 1800s, again, a lot of ideas of what these animals were related to, what they really were, and a number of people thought that they were in some way related to marsupials, which leads to probably my favorite piece of paleo art ever, which is this. And they kind of reconstructed pterosaurs as like flying opossums. I love this piece of art so much, it's incredible. So going over the basic anatomy of a pterosaur. So they had very small bodies, which we'll also see on the next slide. Their hip bones were what we call reduced, so basically very simplified. They had 5 long toes on their feet, and their 5th toe is what we call divergent. So it wasn't opposable like our thumbs, but they did have an extra toe that was kind of separated from the others and at an angle. The pterosaurs had long necks, which led to large heads with pointed jaws. The arm, which is probably the most distinctive part of these animals, they had a little tiny 3-fingered hand, and of course this extra finger that would have supported the wing membrane. So this is like their main finger, or their actual, what is most recognizable as a hand, and this is the 4th finger, just to give you a sense of how like grossly enlarged this extra finger is. And pterosaurs also had, as you might expect, hollow bones, just like modern-day birds. Contrasting with modern-day birds, however, the bone walls of pterosaurs are extraordinarily thin. Like if you slice a pterosaur bone in half or break it in half, which I've done, you'll see that it's just like paper thin. And then the inside of the bone would have been had a lot of like, you know, bony supports and like structures and struts and stuff like that. So again, this is a pterosaur called Anguaria. It's a pretty large pterosaur. We're talking about over a 20-foot wingspan. But again, when you compare the silhouette to just the torso, this thing had a 20-foot wingspan or 23-foot wingspan, but its torso was smaller than mine. So they had itty-bitty little bodies and massive, massive wings. Pterosaurs are also covered, again, in these things called pycnofibers. So they would not have been scaly, they would have been shaggy or hairy. This is the pterosaur wing. And you have this hyperelongated finger, and then the wing membrane would have connected from the tip of that finger to somewhere along the body, like the torso or the ankle or the mid-thigh. It just depends on that position differed on the group and the species you're looking at. So it's kind of varied. And this, you can see it, is a diagram of the wing membrane. So you might think of, membranous wings, like a bat. but unlike a bat, these were actually very complex structures. So they had sheets of muscle and blood vessels and arteries, some other soft tissue to give it like a stiff leading edge for flight. And on the surface of the wing, they would have had these things called actinofibrils. They're basically strands of keratin, so the same stuff that our hair and fingernails made out of. And it would have been visible in life, so you would have seen like some like weird struts on the wing, and that would have just like stiffened the wing further. And each of these animals has a different way of solving the problem, how do I fly? Bats and pterosaurs, at least at first, might seem the most comparable, but unlike bats, which basically have their entire hand splayed out and the membrane connecting its hand, and that's how they fly. They kind of fly around with jazz hands all the time. But pterosaurs, again, have this just one giant finger, and all of this is just membrane. There's no bone in it. So I mentioned the integument earlier. So pterosaurs were covered in pycnofibers, which is a almost kind of between hair and feathers, at least we thought at first. And these pycnofibers were actually first noted all the way back in the 1830s by a German scientist studying a particular pterosaur specimen. Unfortunately, like a decade or two after he discovered or he noted that, another like a big shot herpetologist came along and said, "Oh yeah, like he wasn't actually seeing that. It's not there." And so we didn't rediscover these pycnofibers until some additional pterosaur specimens popped up in the 1950s that had very clear evidence of it. And speaking of this very first specimen, there's actually a paper in 2014 that was going back to look at the specimen, and it vindicated they found like, oh yeah, these actually are pycnofibers that this guy discovered 200 years ago. It just wasn't widely accepted. But not only do they have pycnofibers, more recent research has suggested that at least some pterosaurs would have actually possessed feathers. Not just fibers, but true feathers. And unlike modern day birds, these would have been just for like insulation and or display, whereas birds obviously use them for flight. So here is the feathers in question. So it might not look like much if you're not used to looking at pterosaurs or fossils in general, but these little strands are pycnofibers, and some of these actually split into multiple they tuft up like feathers. A lot of research has been done into how pterosaurs actually took off to get into the air. So for a long time, it was thought that they would have ran on their hind legs and flapped their wings and got into the air, basically like birds. But and there were a couple paleontologists still clinging on to the idea like into the 2000s, but by that time, nearly everyone had accepted the quadrupedal lunge hypothesis. So instead of using their hind limbs, pterosaurs would have literally vaulted themselves into the air with their front limbs, and then started flapping. And if you look at a pterosaur skeleton in a museum, especially if one happens to be like on all fours, you can really see how scrawny and skinny their back leg bones are compared to the super robust, well-developed forelimbs, which is even further evidence for the idea that they really weren't using their back legs for all that much except for walking on the ground. It's even suspected that the pterosaurs that spent a lot of time in water or near water would have been able to take off perfectly fine from the water in this quadrupedal fashion, which is really cool. So pterosaurs, I mentioned how diverse they were. Here's just a snapshot of some of the skulls. You can get a quick idea of how many forms there were in pterosaurs. They have all kinds of skull shapes and tooth shapes that they were using for different things, as well as the crests. The crests might be one of the things that pterosaurs are most well known for, especially species like Pteranodon here. Pterosaur crests could get pretty crazy and extravagant. So much so that you wonder like how they can even fly. And the crest could be either made of bone, or made of keratin, or made of kind of like a fleshy substance, or a combination of the three. Just depends what pterosaur you're looking at. As far as diets are concerned, so a lot of toothed and toothless pterosaurs would have eaten fish. And at some point or another in the pterosaur science, I think every single group of pterosaurs has like, scientists have been like, oh yeah, it ate fish without necessarily much to back it up. But that being said, now that we have a much more refined idea of pterosaur diet, we know that a lot of them were actually eating fish. Smaller species would have been chasing insects, like a Nerd here, which I remember is one of my favorites. It had tiny little peg-like teeth that would have been good for munching on the exoskeletons of bugs. And others would have chased after small vertebrates. Like this Dimorphodon is going to get a little lizard snack, or maybe small mammals. Some would have been probably probe feeders, like modern sandpipers. And the recently discovered Icondrico actually had a pelican-like throat pouch. And others were just increasingly bizarre. Like a whale, so this would have been a filter-feeding pterosaur. So it would have sifted plankton out of the water a lot, like not unlike flamingos. And I mentioned how big some pterosaurs could get, and this can also correlate with diet. So Hatzidopteryx was one of the monstrously giraffe-sized pterosaurs, with a skull 8 to 10 feet long. And it would have feasted on baby dinosaurs and pygmy dinosaurs because it actually lived on an island where it was the giant and all the dinosaurs were kind of shrunken down versions of their groups. So again, this is me at the LA Museum holding a cast of the humerus of Quetzalcoatlus. And just for reference, that's the upper arm bone, and it's about as big as my torso. And this really long bone I'm holding here is one of a single digit of the wing bone. So massive animals. This thing would have been 35-foot wingspan or so. We're talking giraffe size when they're on all fours. This is probably, if I ever went back in time, this is probably one of the animals I'd be scared of the most. Now, pterosaur origins. Where did they come from? What did they evolve from? We don't really know. There are no good transitional forms leading to pterosaurs. So in terms of transitional pterosaurs, we have no transitional pterosaurs. We have some ideas of what might be their next closest relatives. So they might have come from something like a group of animals called Lagurpitids. But as you can see, this is a pretty far cry from it because it looks nothing like a pterosaur, right? This inference is based on some other aspects of the anatomy, but you can see their arms alone are a long ways from becoming what we know of as pterosaurs. So that's one of the biggest mysteries in paleontology, in my opinion, is how did pterosaurs evolve? Pterosaurs laid leathery eggs like modern day reptiles. It wasn't hard like a chicken's. In fact, some fossil nesting sites, like the one this one is from, contain hundreds of eggs. And so that suggests that at least some pterosaurs would have gathered in large groups to nest in colonies, just like certain modern day birds. And CT scans of these eggs reveal that there are actually baby pterosaur bones inside the eggs developing. And so you can see some of here, these are itty bitty bones, these are embryonic pterosaurs developing before they were buried and fossilized, unfortunately. So this is a reconstruction of the pterosaur we just looked at, the adults, called Hemipterus. And this was from a large nesting site in China. But we know some of the reproductive habits of at least one other pterosaur, and that is Darwinopterus over here. You can see that there's a little round object right beneath the body, and that is a pterosaur egg, a little bit, probably only about a couple centimeters long. And we know that this pterosaur in particular had 2 oviducts, which means it could have had 2 eggs at the same time, rather than laying large clutch like some other pterosaurs. So again, how many eggs they could lay depended on what species of pterosaur you're looking at.